Next lightning talk, 3 lines of code at a time. Jeremy Thurgood. So presuming you're going to show us 3 lines of code at a time and then talk about them. No? Okay.
In my actual talk, I had 2 lines of code on a slide. That's all the code I'm going to be showing. And I wrote this after midnight last night and have not read it since I wrote it, so I'll be reading instead of talking the way I usually do. My apologies. Once I've got the font size big enough that I can. No, I'm not presenting. I'm just talking. Well, reading. My name is Jeremy and I have ADHD. I discovered this at age 29, 3 years into my first software development job, 1 month before that job ended. And as I'm sure you all know, ADHD is an attention disorder. My attention span for most things is about that long, which equates to approximately 3 lines of code. So how do I have a successful career in this industry when I can't keep track of more than 3 lines of code at a time? Firstly, 3 lines is kind of an approximation. It depends on the complexity of the lines. Sometimes I can hold as many as 5 in my head, if they're very simple. And software development is mostly about managing complexity. If you do it well, you end up with an organized code base, decent test coverage that's easy to work with. If you do it poorly, which is what most code bases end up like in my experience, you've got an unmaintainable mess. For me, the level of unmaintainable mess is much broader than for most of the people here. So I need to make sure that my code is, the first part, well organized, well structured, easy to work with. So my main tool for that is automated tests. If I have tests to prove that the piece of code I've just written does what I intend it to do, I can safely forget that it exists because I know it works. And when I need it, I'll search the code base for it, and hopefully it's there because I've already written it. Maybe what I need is something new, then I go write that bit. Sometimes that means I write the same thing more than once. Doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. But that's the next point, is naming things is important. If the name isn't the thing that I'm searching for when I need this piece of functionality, then I'm going to write it 6 times because I can never find the thing I wrote because it's badly named. I'm not great at naming things, but I'm much better than I used to be. And I think I'm slightly above kind of industry average based on the code that I've read from other people. So the next important thing is that I need to chop problems into pieces that are small enough that I can actually keep them all in my head at the same time. So for me, functions should be ideally no more than 5 lines long, perhaps up to 10 if it's like a bunch of if statements where each of them does something and it's really simple and easy to reason about. Each function should ideally do exactly one thing, no more or less. If there are 2 things that are inextricably intertwined, a function might be allowed to do both of them at once, because separating them would be more effort and complexity than keeping them together. And with a bunch of little functions, I have to now glue them all together to actually solve the big problem that I want to solve. And this is where the code gets interesting, because Python has a bunch of really, really cool features that make this kind of easier and more intuitive than most languages can. Things like decorators, context managers, generators, that kind of thing. Once you know the features, those things are great. If you're reading a bunch of code that uses these things extensively and you're not familiar with them, not so great, but they're easy enough to learn. On a good day, I can write a couple of hundred lines of useful, reliable, readable code. On a bad day, I write a couple of hundred lines of subtle, well-tested bugs, which will plague me for the next year. Programming is difficult, and it's particularly difficult when you're trying to do it 3 lines of code at a time. But when I succeed, I've got a code base that I can understand 3 weeks later, which means that basically everyone in this room can understand and hopefully find easy enough to work with. And that's how I survive in this industry with an attention span that size.
Sorry, I should stop stepping across that speaker. Thank you, Jeremy.